presence, Jesus began to be grieved and distressed. Now look at 38. Then he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Look at this request. Remain here and keep watch with me. What did Jesus ever ask those men to do? He was the doer, wasn't he? He's asking them to do something for him here. He says, remain here and keep watch with me. What's he saying? He's simply saying, men, pray with me. I need strength. I covet your prayers. You need strength. And so the thing that we must do, he says, is pray. Having charged them with that obligation, 39, look, Jesus went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed. They had to still be looking on. Verse 40, some time elapses. Look at this. Came back to the disciples and found them, now look at this, and found them, are you looking? Sleeping. Jesus said, now look, he didn't say to all of them, do you see this? Who's the leader here? Jesus said, do you see this? Jesus said to Peter, so you men could not keep watch, could not pray with me for 1 hour. Now let me ask you, folks, what's the issue there? Okay, let's rule out a physical side to this. We maybe would be inclined to say, well, the disciples were exhausted, and so physically they were unable to pray with the Lord for an hour. We can write that off. Because after this, they're going to pretty much stay up all night, and so we know that that's not the case. And so the only conclusion that we can reach here is that the issue really is about their spiritual laziness. You see, they were unwilling at this time to do so. And the reason that they were is because they were really swamped over with a prideful kind of self-confidence. And their self-confidence had led them into this foolish notion of self-sufficiency. And when the Lord said, men, it's time to pray, look at this, not with their words, but with their action and going to sleep, those men said, Peter said, no, Jesus, I'm tired. It's not time to pray, it's time to sleep. You'll need to remember this morning that for the Christian, the notion of being self-sufficient is both an illusion and a giant step downward toward defeat. See, they thought that it didn't matter what Jesus wanted because they had it covered. And by the way, let me just give you a personal note here, a practical note. This has been true in my life. I know it's true in yours. You and I must not miss the fact here that one of the main symptoms of self-sufficiency is a deficit of prayer in our lives. Maybe you're sitting here this morning saying, I'm not self-sufficient. I trust in God. You want to know a great way to test that statement? How much time did you spend praying last night? How much time did you spend in prayer last week? How much time did you spend in prayer this morning? See, if you honestly answer, well, not very much, then you know what? You have the very same problem with self-sufficiency that Peter had. We need to shake that. That is a step down on the road to spiritual failure. I'll give you the third step here. If you want to continue on and fail spiritually, listen, be self-willed. Be self-willed. Let me define self-will for you. Self-will is self-centered obstinance. It's saying, I know what's best and I'm going to do it. It sounds, in this particular case, it sounds like this. If you look at Peter's words, it sounds like, Lord, take a seat and let me fix this. Let's see what it looks like. Hold your place in Matthew 26 and turn with me to John chapter 18. This is a text that corresponds with some of the verses that we have in Matthew 26. But the detail here is a little different. Let's look at 6 verses here. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden, that's where we are, in which Jesus entered with his disciples. Now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there, look, with lanterns and torches and weapons. So Jesus, verse 4, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus the Nazarene." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing there with him. Now look at verse 6. So when Jesus said to them, "I am he," now look at this and picture the cohort, picture the soldiers. They drew back and fell to the ground. What an amazing scene that would have been when you have this great self-identification of the Son of God. They all fell to the ground. If you go to Luke chapter 22, verse 49, we're told there that at this point the disciples asked, and this is so like the disciples, what a great opportunity. The disciples asked, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" They're off balance. Man, they've fallen down. Let's get them. Shall we strike with the sword? But guess what? One disciple wasn't asking anything. Right? Go back to Matthew 26, verse 51. Behold, one of those with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. So who is this unidentified samurai? Remember, John and Peter were close. John doesn't spare his friend. He reveals the identity of the swordsman. Chapter 18, verse 10, John says, "Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear." Now, folks, you know that he was not trying to take off his ear. He was swinging for his head. It's the providence of God that caused him to miss. And, you know, that's kind of a sort of a comical episode from a particular vantage point, but there's an important application, a lesson here, and you don't want to miss it. Listen, this is what it is. Self-will blinds us to spiritual reality. Peter's so obsessed with himself. He's so obsessed with carrying out his own plan that he's blinded to God's plan. Of course, it never could have happened, but imagine if Christ could have been prevented from going to the cross. Self-will blinds us to spiritual reality, and it robs us of the ability to discern. Peter should have been grieving, but should have he been trying to stand in the way of the cross? Absolutely not. You look at this and you see that Peter thinks he's going to handle the situation, but in reality he's just swinging wildly. He's doing that because he separated himself from the Lord's plan. He's chosen to do things his own way, and that always results in failure. Just as a footnote here, of course, Jesus is just as in control as Peter's out of control, right? And so Jesus fixes things. He restores the high priest's slave's ear. It's interesting that he's named, isn't it? Maybe he had a change of heart himself. Jesus rebukes Peter and he allows himself to be arrested, right? Jesus is not going to be held back from the cross. In fact, Matthew 26:56 sums all of this up from God's perspective, and it records the fulfillment of the prophetic statement that we've already seen Jesus make in 31. Look at 56. It said, all of this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets. This happened because it was God's purpose. But now look at this. Here was the prophecy. It's going to be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left Jesus and fled. You know what that means? It means that they ran away into the night. So 3 steps down that we've seen to spiritual failure. 1, to fail spiritually, first of all, be pridefully self-confident. Secondly, let that self-confidence grow into self-sufficiency. And the 3rd step down to fail spiritually is, listen, be self-willed. Insist on handling things instead of allowing God to handle them. Now here's the 4th step down. To really fail spiritually, be self-absorbed. Be obsessed with yourself. Be self-absorbed. Peter was. Let me show you. Again, just as Jesus said they would, the frightened disciples, including Peter, have scattered into the night. Jesus is now isolated as he begins down the unjust and illegal path that's going to end at the cross. And look where we find Peter. Again, having fled, look, 57. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. Now look at 58. But Peter was following him at a distance. And what we understand there is that he's following him at a safe distance. Right? He doesn't want to be seen. He doesn't want to be identified. It's dark. And so under the cover of darkness, he's sort of tripping along. And he went as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And then he entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. So what that tells us is that Peter was kind of nearby physically. But we are going to discern that he was long gone spiritually, because you see, Jesus is clearly on the way to the cross. But Peter, again, prideful, unprayerful, and obstinate, his courage having left him, you see, Peter, as we're going to see, has finally entered into full-on self-preservation mode. He's just out there skulking around in the shadows. Listen, I want you to understand today that that's what self-absorption does. It causes you to look out for yourself. And that's where we find Peter. In fact, the fifth and final step is this. If you want to fail spiritually, listen, forsake others, forget about your own calling, forget about your relationship with Christ, and then just go to the next step and make the choice to be self-serving. That's what follows self-absorption, is this mindset of being self-serving. In other words, make it your top priority to look out for number one, and don't let anything get in the way of serving and protecting yourself. This is what's happened to Peter. The thing that we see here is that self-service really is the cumulative sort of sum of all of those first four steps. You see, it's here that self becomes so important that the end result that you desire justifies any means of getting there. Disloyalty is fine. Cowardice is fine. Lying is fine. And you see, those are really the three things that are going to characterize Peter's life during this whole episode. He's going to be a disloyal, lying coward. The amazing thing is that none of that matters to him.
And feel